The chandeliers of Pemberton House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light fracturing through crystal teardrops to scatter diamonds across the gathered assembly, and the air itself seemed thick with the weight of celebration, heavy with mingled perfumes of rose and jasmine, the sweet decay of hothouse lilies crowding every alcove, the heady scent of champagne and human warmth pressed too close together in the magnificent ballroom where Lady Catherine Ashford stood at the periphery. Her gloved hands clutching her fan with a desperation she prayed appeared merely decorative. She had positioned herself near the terrace doors where a thread of cooler air occasionally offered mercy from the suffocating heat, though even that small relief had begun to fail as the evening progressed and the press of bodies grew denser, everyone eager to witness this most anticipated moment of the season, the formal announcement of Duke Edmund Hartwell's engagement to the incomparable Lady Rosalind Pemberton. Catherine's gaze, despite every effort of will, remained fixed upon the dais where Edmund stood, his tall figure elegant in black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from a face she had memorized through years of stolen glances and careful observation, a face that had once been as familiar to her as her own reflection when they were children running through adjoining estates, before duty and station and the inexorable passage of time had transformed him into this distant, untouchable figure who even now raised his glass to toast the radiant beauty beside him. Rosalind, golden-haired and rose-cheeked, smiled with the serene confidence of a woman who had never doubted her own worth or desirability, her sapphire gown precisely matching the famous Pemberton jewels that encircled her throat, and Catherine felt the corset stays bite deeper into her ribs as she drew a breath that wouldn't quite fill her lungs. Asterisk, he chose her, asterisk, Catherine thought. The words a litany of pain she had been repeating since the engagement was first announced 3 weeks prior. Asterisk, of course, he chose her. How could he choose otherwise? How could I have ever imagined? Asterisk. But she had imagined, in those secret hours before dawn when honesty becomes inevitable, she had allowed herself to remember the way Edmund's eyes would find hers across crowded rooms, the quality of attention he gave her when they spoke, different somehow from his interactions with others, or perhaps she had only wished it different, had constructed meaning from coincidence and proximity, had mistaken the comfortable regard of an old acquaintance for something deeper. The room tilted slightly as Edmund began to speak, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly, formal words about honor and happiness and the blessing of finding one's perfect complement, and Catherine registered with distant alarm that her vision had begun to swim at the edges, dark spots blooming like ink in water. The heat pressed against her temples, her stays seemed to constrict further with each shallow breath, and the roaring in her ears rose to drown out Edmund's voice, even as she watched his lips form words she could no longer hear. Her fan slipped from nerveless fingers. The floor rushed upward, and in the final fragment of consciousness before darkness claimed her entirely, she saw faces turning toward her in a blur of shock and curiosity, heard the collective gasp of scandal rippling through the assembly, and then there was only Edmund's face above hers, his grey eyes wide with something that looked impossibly like terror, his hand reaching for her as she fell into oblivion. Catherine returned to consciousness in a small withdrawing room off the main ballroom. The sounds of the celebration muffled now by heavy damask curtains and closed doors, and her first awareness was of her maid Mary's worried face hovering above her, followed immediately by the grey-bearded visage of Dr. Whitmore, who had been attending the Ashford family since Catherine's childhood, his cool fingers on her wrist, checking her pulse, while he murmured reassurances she could barely process through the crushing wave of mortification that swept over her as memory returned in vivid, excruciating detail. She had fainted, actually collapsed in full view of London's most elite assembly, had disrupted the Duke of Hartwell's engagement announcement with a spectacle of weakness that would be discussed in every drawing room and whispered behind every fan for weeks to come, and the humiliation burned through her with such intensity that she wished desperately to sink back into unconsciousness rather than face what she had done. Dr. Whitmore pronounced her recovered from a mere bout of overheating and excessive compression of her stays, prescribed rest and cooler environments, and departed with professional discretion while Mary helped her to a sitting position and pressed a glass of water into her trembling hands, and Catherine became aware of voices in the corridor beyond the door, her mother's controlled tones speaking with someone, arranging their immediate departure, sparing Catherine the unbearable ordeal of returning to face the assembled guests. Within the hour she found herself in their carriage, rattling through London's dark streets toward their townhouse, her mother seated beside her in sympathetic silence, asking no questions that Catherine could not have borne to answer, and by dawn they had departed the city entirely, fled like criminals or invalids to the sanctuary of Ashford Manor in Hertfordshire, where Catherine could hide from the knowing looks and barely concealed curiosity of society. In the days that followed, alone in her childhood bedroom with its familiar pale blue walls and view of the rose garden, Catherine finally allowed herself to examine the depth of feeling she had so carefully concealed, even from her own conscious acknowledgement during the years since she and Edmund had grown from children into adults, whose stations and expectations had drawn them into different orbits. She remembered the boy who had taught her to climb the old oak on the boundary between their estates, who had shared his Latin texts when her governess despaired of her conjugations, who had looked at her with such unguarded affection before duty and inheritance, and the weight of his title had transformed him into the remote, controlled Duke of Hartwell, who moved through society with perfect propriety and no visible passion. Asterisk, he never saw me as anything but a familiar presence. Asterisk, she told herself. Asterisk, a comfortable remnant of childhood, someone safe and undemanding, while I, asterisk, while she had constructed entire edifices of meaning from the smallest gestures, had hoarded each conversation like a miser counting gold, and allowed herself to hope in secret that perhaps someday he might look at her and see not merely Lady Catherine Ashford, whom he had known forever, but a woman worthy of the deeper regard she had observed him give to others, who were more beautiful, more accomplished, more everything than she could ever be. The pain of accepting that Edmund had chosen Rosalind perfect, luminous Rosalind who deserved every happiness, settled into Catherine's chest like a stone, cold and heavy and permanent, and she resolved to remain at Ashford Manor until the wedding had concluded and enough time had passed that her return to society would not immediately recall her spectacular humiliation, until she could face the world again with composure and dignity, until she could school her features into perfect indifference at the mention of the Duke and Duchess of Hartwell, until she could convince even herself that her heart had never been engaged at all. The weeks that followed Catherine's retreat to Ashford Manor unfolded with the slow, melancholic beauty of autumn's decline. Each day shorter than the last, the light growing golden and slanted as it filtered through trees that shed their leaves in gradual surrender to the approaching cold, and Catherine found herself walking the estate's gardens with increasing frequency, her shawl wrapped tight against the crisp air, her steps taking her along familiar paths between flower beds gone dormant and hedgerows turning brown, as if the physical movement might somehow ease the persistent ache that had settled beneath her breastbone and refused to fade despite her firm internal lectures about dignity and acceptance. Her mother, Lady Ashford, watched these solitary rambles with the quiet concern of a woman who understood more than her daughter wished to reveal, and over breakfast or tea, she would offer gentle openings for conversation, observations about Catherine's pallor, questions about whether she might benefit from a visit to Bath for the waters, subtle inquiries about whether anyone particular had written from London, but Catherine deflected each approach with practiced ease, insisting that she was merely tired from the season's exertions, that the country air was restoring her perfectly well, that she had no interest in news from town, and wished only to occupy herself with quieter pursuits until the winter had passed. She filled her days with the activities deemed appropriate for a lady of her station. She read extensively from her father's library, working through volumes of poetry that seemed to speak directly to her wounded heart. She maintained correspondence with several school friends who wrote with sympathy about her collapse from the heat, without mentioning the more scandalous timing of that collapse. She accompanied her mother on visits to the tenants, where she distributed baskets, and inquired after the health of children with genuine interest that provided blessed hours of forgetting her own troubles, and she devoted considerable time to her needlework, creating an elaborate design of intertwined roses and thorns that seemed to grow more complicated and darker in its imagery as the weeks progressed. Yet beneath this composed surface of productive activity, the pain remained constant, a dull throb that would sharpen unexpectedly at random moments when she passed the old oak tree on the estate boundary where she and Edmund had played as children. when she heard her father mention something about the Hartwell lands in casual conversation, when a letter arrived from her aunt in London, and she found herself searching the gossip columns for any mention of his name before she could stop herself. The occasional news that did reach Ashford Manor from the capital arrived through various channels: her aunt's letters, her father's correspondence with business associates, visitors who called and could not resist sharing the latest on Ditz, and Catherine learned, despite her attempts at indifference, that the wedding preparations for the Duke of Hartwell and Lady Rosalind Pemberton were proceeding apace, that the Duke himself had been rarely seen in society since his engagement ball, that Lady Rosalind was being fitted for her trousseau, and the ceremony was anticipated before Christmas. Each mention of Edmund's name caused Catherine to flinch internally, even as she maintained perfect composure externally, and she told herself firmly that she was healing, that time and distance were performing their restorative work, and that soon she would be able to hear of his marriage without this sharp twist of loss. But she knew with bleak honesty that she was merely learning to live with the pain rather than transcending it, building a careful structure of normalcy around a wound that continued to bleed in secret. The carriage that arrived at Ashford Manor 2 months after Catherine's retreat bore the crest of the Blackwood family, and Catherine felt her heart constrict with apprehension when the butler announced that Lord Thomas Blackwood requested the honour of an audience, for Thomas was Edmund's closest friend from their school days, his most trusted companion, and his presence here could only mean that some news of significance had prompted this unexpected journey into Hertfordshire. She received him in the drawing-room with her mother present as propriety demanded, and observed immediately that Thomas's usually jovial countenance bore an expression of troubled seriousness that sat strangely on features more accustomed to laughter and easy charm. He made the required pleasantries about his journey and the weather and the beauty of the Ashford estate with obvious distraction, and Catherine found herself growing increasingly tense as he circled whatever purpose had brought him here, until finally, her mother, with the perception that had characterized all her recent dealings with Catherine, excused herself on the pretext of attending to household matters, and Catherine was left alone with Thomas, who seemed to sag with relief at the departure. "Lady Catherine," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I have debated for weeks whether I have any right to come here, whether what I observed gives me license to interfere in matters that are not my concern, but I find I cannot remain silent when I am almost certain, that a terrible mistake is being made by 2 people I hold in great affection." Catherine's hands tightened on the arms of her chair, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "I do not understand your meaning, Lord Blackwood," though she feared desperately that she might. Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest and troubled. "The wedding has been postponed indefinitely," he said bluntly. "Lady Rosalind has taken ill, nothing serious, but enough to delay the ceremony. But that is not why I have come. Lady Catherine, I was present when you fainted at the engagement ball. I was standing quite near Edmund when it happened, and I saw his face in that moment." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I have known Edmund Hartwell since we were boys of 8, at Eton. I have seen him face down charging horses, receive news of his father's death, stand before Parliament to defend legislation he believed in. I have never, in all those years, seen such terror in a man's eyes as I witnessed when you collapsed. He reached you before anyone else could move, caught you as you fell, and the expression on his face was that of a man watching his entire world crumble." Catherine found she could not breathe properly, could not formulate a response to this revelation that upended everything she had believed about that horrible evening. "Why, he spoke your name," Thomas continued quietly, "with such anguish, such desperate concern, that several people near us remarked upon it. And in the days since, I have watched him move through society like a man condemned, performing his duties with perfect correctness while seeming absent from his own life. Lady Catherine, I cannot claim to know the state of your heart, and perhaps I am overstepping all bounds of propriety, but I felt compelled to tell you that whatever society believes about the Duke of Hartwell's feelings, whatever he has led everyone, including possibly himself, to believe, his reaction in that unguarded moment suggested that his affections may not lie where his engagement would indicate." Thomas departed shortly after, leaving Catherine to navigate the storm of emotions his visit had unleashed, and she sat alone in the drawing-room as afternoon faded to evening, Unable to reconcile this new information with her firm conviction that Edmund had never regarded her as anything more than a comfortable friend, terrified to allow hope to take root when the situation remained impossible, yet unable to prevent the tentative, fragile possibility from unfurling in her chest like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. The days following Thomas Blackwood's departure unfolded with excruciating slowness for Catherine, each hour stretching into something that felt both too long and somehow insufficient for the magnitude of the emotions she was attempting to process, and she found herself caught in a cycle of examination and re-examination that left her exhausted yet unable to rest, her mind returning obsessively to every interaction she had ever shared with Edmund Hartwell, viewing each memory through the new lens that Thomas's revelation had provided. She would lie awake in the dark hours before dawn, replaying moments she had experienced years ago, the musicale at Lady Thornbury's, where Edmund had stood beside the pianoforte and watched her with an expression she had interpreted as polite interest, but which now, reconsidered, might have held something deeper. The afternoon at Richmond, when their party had walked along the river, and Edmund had somehow always positioned himself at her side, his conversation directed primarily to her, while others paired off around them, the ball where she had worn the blue silk gown, and had caught him staring at her with such intensity that she had felt heat rise to her cheeks before he had quickly looked away. Each memory seemed transformed by this new possibility, taking on shades of meaning that Catherine desperately wanted to believe in, yet feared were merely the projections of her own hopeless longing. For was it not the particular torture of unrequited love to find evidence of reciprocation in the most ambiguous gestures, to construct elaborate meanings from glances that might signify nothing more than momentary distraction? She would catch herself building these fragile structures of hope and then deliberately tear them down with ruthless logic, reminding herself that Edmund was engaged to another woman, that even if Thomas had correctly interpreted that moment of terror when she fainted, one moment of concern did not constitute love, that she had no right to his affections and no power to alter his circumstances, even if those affections did exist. The impossibility of her situation became increasingly clear as November deepened into December and the first snowfall arrived at Ashford Manor, transforming the landscape into something pure and frozen and somehow appropriate to the emotional state. Catherine was determined to cultivate within herself a deliberate numbness, a protective layer of ice over the raw wound that Thomas's visit had reopened just as it had begun to scar over. She made a conscious decision to continue her retreat from society, to make no attempt to contact Edmund or to interfere in any way with whatever resolution he and Lady Rosalind would reach regarding their postponed wedding, for honor demanded that she respect his engagement regardless of what her heart desperately wished to believe about his feelings, and she would not become the sort of woman who pursued an attached man or allowed herself to hope for another woman's misfortune. The snow continued to fall as Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching the gardens disappear beneath white drifts, and she told herself that this cold, this deliberate freezing of hope, was a form of mercy, better to feel nothing than to feel everything, and have no outlet for the overwhelming tide of love and loss and desperate possibility that threatened to drown her whenever she allowed her defenses to slip. Christmas arrived at Ashford Manor with all the traditional preparations that had marked the season for generations. The great hall decorated with garlands of holly and ivy, the Yule log prepared for the hearth, the kitchens filled with the rich aromas of roasting meats and spiced puddings, and yet Catherine moved through these festive surroundings with a melancholy that seemed to deepen rather than lift in the face of enforced merriment, for there was something particularly cruel about celebrating joy and goodwill when one's own heart felt frozen in a state of perpetual winter. Her younger sister Eleanor arrived from London 3 days before Christmas Eve, bursting into the manor with her characteristic energy and immediately filling the quiet spaces with chatter and laughter, and Catherine found herself grateful for the distraction, even as she dreaded the inevitable questions, for Eleanor had always possessed an uncanny ability to perceive truths that others missed, and a complete inability to leave uncomfortable subjects unexamined. The questions came on Christmas Eve as the sisters sat together in Catherine's room, while Eleanor's maid arranged her hair for the evening's family dinner, and Eleanor, watching Catherine's reflection in the mirror with those sharp, knowing eyes, said without preamble, The gossip in London is all about the Duke of Hartwell and his indefinitely postponed wedding. Lady Rosalind has recovered from her illness and remains in Bath. The wedding date remains unscheduled, and Edmund himself has become positively glacial in society, attending only the most obligatory functions and speaking to virtually no one. Catherine's hands stilled on the ribbon she had been absently twisting, and she replied with studied indifference, "I am sure the Duke's affairs are no concern of mine." But Eleanor made an unladylike sound of disbelief and dismissed her maid with a wave of her hand before turning to face Catherine directly with an expression of affectionate exasperation. "Catherine, I am not one of those vapid society creatures who cannot see past the surface of things. I know you fainted at that ball, not from the heat, but from something far more significant, and I have watched you retreat into this self-imposed exile with a broken heart you refuse to acknowledge. And now I hear that Thomas Blackwood made a mysterious visit here some weeks ago, and I am putting these pieces together into a picture that suggests your heart and the Duke's heart may be suffering from the same affliction." The directness of Eleanor's confrontation broke through the careful defenses Catherine had constructed, and she found herself confessing in a voice barely above a whisper, "I loved him, Eleanor. I have loved him for years, but it is irrelevant. He chose another. He made his decision, and I must respect it and find some way to build a life that does not include him." And she was horrified to feel tears threatening for the first time since she had cultivated her protective numbness. Eleanor moved to sit beside her sister, taking Catherine's cold hands in her own warm ones, and said with a gentleness that was unusual for her typically forthright manner, "But did he choose, Catherine? Or did he choose what was expected, what duty and family and society demanded, without ever consulting what his heart truly desired? And if his heart desired differently, if it desired you, would that not explain why a man who should be celebrating his approaching marriage instead moves through the world like a ghost? Why a wedding that should have occurred months ago remains perpetually delayed? Why he looks, according to every account I have heard, like a man serving a sentence rather than anticipating happiness?" The seeds of doubt that Thomas had planted and that Catherine had tried so desperately to suppress suddenly found new purchase in Eleanor's words, and she spent the remainder of Christmas in a state of painful hope, wondering if perhaps Edmund's choice had not been as clear or as final as she had believed, wondering if somewhere in London he was experiencing the same frozen misery that had claimed her, wondering if two hearts that loved each other were being kept apart, not by genuine obstacles, but by honor and assumption and fear. The letter arrived on a grey January afternoon, when Catherine had been sitting in the morning room, attempting to focus on correspondence that seemed impossibly trivial responses to distant cousins' inquiries about her health, a note of thanks to an elderly aunt for a Christmas gift, and when the butler entered with the silver salver bearing a single envelope, she had glanced at it with disinterest until she recognized the handwriting and felt her entire body respond as though she had touched something electric, her fingers beginning to tremble even as she reached for the letter, her heart suddenly racing with such violence that she feared she might actually faint again as she had at that cursed ball 6 months earlier. She dismissed the butler with some phrase she could not later recall and sat for a full minute, simply holding the envelope, staring at her name written in Edmund's distinctive hand, strong, precise letters that somehow managed to convey both formality and intimacy before she found the courage to break the seal and unfold the single sheet of heavy paper within. The letter's contents were carefully worded, maintaining the proper distance expected in correspondence between acquaintances, yet Catherine could detect beneath the formal language an undercurrent of something deeper, as though Edmund had labored over every word to convey meanings that propriety would not permit him to state directly. He wrote that he had thought often of her welfare since the unfortunate incident at his engagement ball, and he hoped most sincerely that the country air and rest had restored her health completely, for her collapse had caused him considerable concern, and Catherine's breath caught at that phrase, at the admission of concern that seemed to carry far more weight than such words typically warranted. He continued that his own circumstances had become unsettled in recent months, that matters which had seemed clear and determined had become complicated in ways he had not anticipated, and that he found himself questioning decisions made with what he had believed to be certainty, but which now appeared to have been merely resignation to expectation. The letter concluded with a request that pierced through Catherine's carefully maintained defenses. Edmund would be visiting the neighbouring Thornfield estate in February to attend to some business matters, and he asked her permission to call upon her at Ashford Manor, if such a visit would not be unwelcome or improper, for he found himself desiring the company of old friends, and she had always been among the most valued of those friends, even when time and circumstance had created distance between them. Catherine read the letter 3 times, analysing every word, every phrase, searching for the true meaning beneath the careful formality, her emotions swinging wildly between hope and caution, between the desperate desire to believe that this letter signified something important, and the fear that she was once again constructing elaborate meanings from ambiguous evidence. She spent 2 days in agonized deliberation, composing and discarding multiple responses, weighing every possible interpretation of Edmund's words and every possible consequence of her reply, before finally settling on a brief note that matched his formality, while leaving the door open to possibility she would be pleased to receive him when he visited Thornfield. Such a call would be entirely proper, given their long acquaintance, and she hoped that his business in the neighbourhood would proceed smoothly. She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, dispatched it with instructions for immediate posting, and then spent the remaining weeks of January in a state of anxious anticipation that made the earlier months of protective numbness seem almost preferable, for at least numbness did not involve this constant oscillation between hope and dread, this exhausting vigilance of emotion that left her simultaneously longing for February and fearing its arrival. The weeks between Catherine's dispatching of her cautious acceptance and Edmund's promised arrival in February stretched with an elastic quality that made time seem both agonizingly slow and frighteningly swift, for she found herself caught between desperate anticipation and paralyzing dread, alternating between states of hope that left her breathless and skepticism that mocked her for constructing elaborate fantasies from a simple letter requesting permission for a friendly call. She paid attention to her appearance with a meticulousness that she tried to disguise as ordinary maintenance, selecting and rejecting day dresses with more care than she had devoted to any ball gown, instructing her maid to arrange her hair in styles that appeared effortlessly elegant while actually requiring considerable effort, and then berating herself for such vanity when Edmund's visit might signify nothing more than duty to an old acquaintance. The internal debate consumed her quiet hours as she attempted to prepare herself for every possible interpretation of his intentions. Was this merely a courtesy call to ensure her recovery, an obligation he felt toward a childhood friend who had embarrassed herself spectacularly at his engagement ball? Or did his letter's careful phrasing and oblique references to complicated circumstances suggest something deeper, a reaching across the distance that had grown between them toward a connection that had never truly been severed? She feared revealing too much, feared that her face would betray the depth of feelings she had tried so desperately to bury, feared experiencing again the humiliation of loving someone who could not or would not return that love, and yet beneath all her fear ran a current of stubborn hope that refused to be entirely extinguished. The morning of Edmund's expected arrival dawned grey and cold, with heavy clouds threatening snow and a biting wind that rattled the windows of Ashford Manor, and Catherine, dressed with trembling hands in a gown of deep blue wool that Eleanor had declared brought out the colour of her eyes, while appearing entirely unstudied and appropriate for receiving an old friend. She positioned herself in the drawing-room with what she hoped appeared to be casual occupation, settling near the fire with needlework she had no intention of actually completing, arranging herself in a pose that suggested comfortable indifference, while her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence that she wondered if it might be visible through the fabric of her dress. When she finally heard the sound of hoofbeats on the drive, that unmistakable rhythm of a single horse approaching at a measured pace, her hand stilled on the embroidery hoop, and she drew a breath that seemed insufficient for her, suddenly, desperate lungs, and she remained frozen in that attitude of forced composure as she heard the butler's measured footsteps crossing the hall, the low murmur of voices at the door, and then his formal announcement, "The Duke of Hartwell, my lady." Catherine rose on legs that felt uncertain beneath her, turning toward the doorway as Edmund entered, and their eyes met across the space of the drawing-room in a moment of charged silence that seemed to contain all the words neither of them had spoken, all the months of separation and confusion and carefully unacknowledged longing. And she saw in his face, thinner than she remembered, with new lines of tension around his eyes and mouth, an expression that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded that flickered across his features before he schooled them into the proper mask of polite greeting, and in that instant, before propriety claimed them both, Catherine knew with devastating certainty that this visit would change everything. Edmund's greeting was impeccably formal, a proper bow, words of gratitude for receiving him, inquiries about her family's health delivered in the measured tones of polite society. Yet Catherine could see beneath the careful composure an emotion he was struggling to contain, something in the tension of his shoulders and the slight unsteadiness of his hands as he removed his gloves that spoke of feelings far deeper than propriety would acknowledge. Their initial conversation maintained the requisite distance, stilted exchanges about safe topics that felt almost absurd given the weight of unspoken matters hovering between them like a physical presence in the room. Catherine remarked on the coldness of the season, and Edmund agreed that winter had been particularly bitter. She inquired about his journey from Thornfield, and he assured her the roads were tolerably clear despite the threatening weather. He asked after her parents' health, and she confirmed they were quite well, though her father's rheumatism troubled him in damp weather. As they spoke these meaningless pleasantries, Catherine observed him with an attention that bordered on hunger, cataloguing every detail. He had indeed grown thinner, his face more angular than she remembered, with shadows beneath his grey eyes that suggested sleepless nights, and there was a quality to his bearing that seemed simultaneously more constrained and more fragile, as though he were holding himself together through sheer force of will. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her in return, whether he noted how the months of country solitude had changed her, the new wariness in her expression and the careful control she maintained over her features, the woman she had become through suffering, the humiliation of public collapse and private heartbreak. They sat on opposite sides of the drawing-room as convention demanded, the space between them feeling both too great and dangerously insufficient, and the conversation continued its careful dance around everything that mattered, until Catherine, desperate to break through the suffocating formality, asked with studied casualness after his own health, and Edmund's composure flickered for just an instant before he replied in a voice that carried unexpected rawness, "I have not been myself since last autumn. Lady Catherine, I find that circumstances I believed settled have unsettled me entirely, and I am not the man I thought I was, nor living the life I imagined I would live." The admission hung in the air between them, far more revealing than anything else he might have said, and Catherine felt her carefully maintained defenses trembling as she met his gaze and saw in his eyes a reflection of her own confusion and longing. But before either could venture further into dangerous territory, the moment passed and Edmund was rising, claiming he had already imposed too long upon her hospitality, and as he prepared to take his leave, he turned to her with an expression of such naked hope and apprehension that her breath caught, asking in formal words that barely concealed their true meaning whether he might have permission to call upon her again, for he found that the neighborhood agreed with him remarkably well, and he anticipated extending his stay at Thornfield for some weeks yet. Catherine granted permission with equal formality, knowing even as she spoke the careful words that they were both engaging in something dangerous, that each visit would draw them deeper into an impossible situation, but unable and unwilling to deny either him or herself this connection. And as Edmund departed and she watched his figure disappear into the grey afternoon, she understood that whatever restraint had governed their relationship before had been irrevocably breached, and there would be no returning to the safe distance of mere acquaintance. Edmund's second visit came 3 days after the first, and then another followed 4 days later, and within a fortnight a pattern had established itself whereby he appeared at Ashford Manor twice weekly, with a regularity that suggested neither accident nor mere courtesy, and with each encounter the careful formality that had characterized their first reunion dissolved by degrees until they found themselves speaking with something approaching the ease of their childhood friendship, though now every conversation carried an undercurrent of awareness that had never existed in those innocent years. They took to walking in the winter gardens when weather permitted, Catherine wrapped in furs against the cold, while Edmund matched his longer stride to hers, and they would traverse the frost-hardened paths, speaking of books and philosophy, of memories from their youth and observations about the world, of everything and nothing, never touching upon the subjects that most occupied their thoughts, yet somehow communicating volumes through what remained unspoken. Catherine observed with growing certainty that something in Edmund's bearing changed when he was in her presence, as though he could set down a weight he carried everywhere else. The tension would gradually leave his shoulders over the course of a visit. The lines around his mouth would soften, and occasionally she would catch him looking at her with an expression of such unguarded longing that her heart would constrict painfully in her chest before he would notice her notice and school his features back into acceptable neutrality. Their conversations grew longer and ranged more widely, touching upon matters of genuine substance rather than mere pleasantries, and Catherine discovered that the Edmund she had known in childhood, thoughtful, quietly humorous, deeply feeling beneath his reserved exterior, had not been lost to duty and propriety, but merely buried, and in her company that true self emerged like something long imprisoned, finally glimpsing light. He began to speak more freely about his dissatisfaction with his life, though never explicitly mentioning Rosalind or the engagement that still technically bound him, referring instead to obligations that felt increasingly suffocating and choices made for reasons that no longer seemed sufficient. And Catherine understood that he was confessing as much as honor would permit, offering her pieces of truth that she must assemble into a whole he could not directly articulate. The torture of their situation grew more acute with each visit, the closeness without acknowledgement, the love that existed in everything but word, the impossibility that they both understood, separated, knowing from having, and yet neither could bring themselves to end the visits or to maintain proper distance, for these hours together had become necessary as breathing, a respite from the pain of their circumstances, even as they intensified that very pain. There were moments of such exquisite tension that Catherine thought she might shatter from it. Edmund reaching for a book on the library shelf at the same instant she did, their hands nearly touching before both pulled back as though burned, his fingers briefly steadying her elbow when she slipped on an icy path, the contact lasting only seconds but seeming to burn through the fabric of her coat, the way their eyes would meet and hold across the drawing room until one or the other would have to look away or risk revealing too much. Thomas had been right. Catherine knew now with absolute certainty Edmund's feelings for her existed and ran deep, perhaps as deep as her own feelings for him, but he was bound by honor to another woman, trapped in an engagement he could not honorably escape, and so they continued this careful dance of nearness and restraint, stealing what happiness they could from friendship while denying themselves everything else, two people loving each other across a distance of mere feet that might as well have been an unbridgeable chasm. The storm arrived with startling violence on a March afternoon, when the world had just begun hinting at spring, the sky darkening to an ominous pewter and wind suddenly howling around the manor's corners, with a ferocity that sent servants rushing to secure shutters and brought Catherine's mother fretting about the gardens, and Catherine was standing at the drawing-room window watching the first fat drops of rain strike the glass when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, and knew with an instinct that bypassed rational thought that it was Edmund, arriving just as the storm broke in earnest, and indeed when she turned from the window he was being ushered in by the butler, his greatcoat darkened with rain and his hair dishevelled from wind, apologizing for the intrusion, but explaining he had been caught between estates when the weather turned, and Ashford Manor was the nearest shelter. The household quickly became occupied with storm preparations, her father directing footmen to check for leaks, her mother supervising the kitchen's preparations in case the roads became impassable and their guest required accommodation overnight. Servants hurrying through corridors on various urgent errands, and in the organized chaos, Catherine found herself alone with Edmund in the library, the storm's intensity increasing until rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled overhead with a violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor, and the tumult outside felt like a physical manifestation of the emotional turbulence that had been building between them for weeks. All the restraint and careful distance suddenly rendered absurd by the raw power of the elements. Edmund's agitation became increasingly apparent. As the storm raged, he paced before the fire rather than sitting, ran his hands through his hair repeatedly, started sentences and abandoned them, his usual careful composure fracturing before her eyes, and Catherine felt her own control slipping, the tension that had accumulated through all those careful visits suddenly unbearable, and finally she spoke the question that cut through all pretense. "Why do you come here, Edmund?" Her use of his Christian name was itself a breach of the formality they had maintained, and he stopped pacing and turned to face her, and she saw in his expression such naked anguish that her breath caught as he said hoarsely, "You know why, Catherine. God help me. You must know why." His composure was cracking like ice under pressure, and the confession emerged in fragments he could no longer contain. His engagement had been arranged by pressure from both families eager for the alliance. He had agreed out of duty, and because he believed himself incapable of inspiring warmer feelings in any woman, he had convinced himself that affection might grow from respect and compatibility, even though his heart was not engaged, and all the while he had been a coward because he had felt something for her, for Catherine, since they were hardly more than children. But he had never believed those feelings returned, and had thought himself too cold and too bound by obligation to interest someone of her warmth and vitality, and so he had done what was expected and offered for a woman he did not love, while the woman he did love watched from across a ballroom, and Catherine felt the room spinning as understanding crashed over her with the force of the thunder outside, and she whispered, "I fainted because of you." Edmund crossed the space between them in 3 strides, his hands reaching for hers and gripping them with an intensity that would have been improper under any other circumstances, and his voice was raw as he said, "Yes, God, yes. Catherine, when I saw you fall, when I saw the color drain from your face and your body crumple, in that moment I understood with perfect and devastating clarity that I had made the most catastrophic mistake of my life, that I had been so consumed with doing what was expected that I had betrayed the only truth that mattered, and I have loved you since we were barely more than children, since you were 16, and laughed at something I said in your father's garden, and the sound of it struck me like a physical blow. And I have loved you through every season since then, through every ball and dinner and chance encounter, but I convinced myself you could never regard me as anything but a duty-bound bore, too serious and too cold for someone of your vitality, and so I accepted the match. My family pressed upon me because I thought myself incapable of inspiring warmer feelings in any woman of sense, and certainly not in you. But when you fainted, I saw my future stretch before me, with horrible clarity, years bound to a woman I did not love, while the woman I loved, with every fiber of my being, slipped away from me forever, and I have been in agony since that moment, trapped by my own foolish honor in an engagement I should never have made." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as her own confession emerged in a torrent she could no longer contain, telling him that she had loved him for just as long, that she had cherished every conversation and hoarded every glance like precious coins, that she had attended his engagement ball, fully intending to witness his happiness with Grace, and then retreat to nurse her broken heart in private, but that seeing him announce his betrothal to another had been more than her body could bear, and consciousness had simply fled, and she had spent these months believing he saw her as nothing more than a familiar presence from childhood, while all along he had carried the same secret pain she harbored. They stood in the storm-darkened library with hands clasped, and years of misunderstanding crumbling between them, and the recognition of their mutual blindness was almost as painful as the original loss, for they saw now how much time had been wasted in silence and assumption, how much suffering might have been prevented by a single moment of courage. But then Edmund's expression shifted from joy to anguish as he said, "But Catherine, I am still bound by honor. I offered marriage to Lady Rosalind. Before witnesses, our families have announced the engagement. I cannot simply withdraw without cause regardless of my feelings, and I will not dishonor her or subject her to scandal simply because I was fool enough to offer for her when my heart belonged elsewhere." Catherine felt the hope that had been building shatter like glass, understanding that he was right, that there was no honorable path forward, even though they had finally spoken the truth. And she said through tears, "Then we have found each other only to lose each other again, and perhaps that is what we deserve for our years of cowardice." But Edmund pulled her closer and said desperately, "I deserve that fate, but you deserve every happiness, and I will find a way, Catherine. I swear to you I will find an honorable way forward, even if I cannot yet see what it is." And then he was kissing her with all the accumulated longing of years, and she was kissing him back, and it was desperate and bittersweet, and tasted of tears and impossibility. A single stolen moment of what might have been before honor and duty reclaimed them both, and when they finally broke apart, they stood with foreheads touching, while the storm raged outside, and their own hearts raged within, loving each other completely, and believing that love must remain forever unfulfilled. Edmund departed Ashford Manor the following morning after the storm had passed, the world washed clean and achingly bright under a pale sky, and Catherine stood at her window, watching his figure disappear down the drive, with the sensation that her heart was being drawn from her chest on a tether that stretched but would not break. For though they had acknowledged the impossibility of their situation, she now carried the knowledge that her love was returned, that she had not suffered alone all these years, and that knowledge was both balm and torture, easing one pain while inflicting another, perhaps more acute. The weeks that followed were a peculiar torment of waiting without knowing what she waited for, days passing with agonizing slowness while she existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward or back, caught between despair and hope in measures that shifted by the hour, and she found herself revisiting that kiss in the library with a frequency that bordered on obsession, the memory of his mouth on hers, in his hands in her hair, the taste of tears and rain and years of longing finally given voice, and she wondered if that single stolen moment would have to sustain her through a lifetime of his absence. Her mother came to her room one evening a fortnight after Edmund's departure and sat beside her on the bed with the kind of gentle determination that indicated she would not be deflected, and after a long silence she said quietly, "I have known of your feelings for the Duke for some time, Catherine, just as I have observed his visits here and the manner in which he looks at you, and I am not so old that I have forgotten what it is to love without hope of fulfillment," and Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks as her mother continued. "Honorable hearts often suffer most, my dear, because they bind themselves to principles even when those principles cause great pain, but honor must sometimes bend to truth, for there is no virtue in maintaining a commitment that will bring misery to all parties involved, and I believe the Duke to be a man of sufficient integrity to seek an honorable resolution, even if the path is not immediately clear." Catherine wanted desperately to believe her mother's words, but feared allowing hope too much rain lest it lead only to greater disappointment, and she said through her tears, "But what resolution is possible when he has given his word before God and society?" And her mother replied, "That I cannot say, but I know that love such as yours is not common, and when it exists, it should not be easily surrendered to circumstance." News arrived through Thomas Blackwood 3 weeks after the storm, delivered in a brief note that sent Catherine's heart racing, even as she forced herself to read the words slowly. Edmund had travelled to Bath to speak with Lady Rosalind and her family regarding matters of consequence, and the outcome as yet unknown. But Thomas thought Catherine should be aware that Edmund had departed London with an expression of grim determination, and the comment that he would either return free or not return at all. Catherine read the note until she had memorized every word, and the agonized waiting began in earnest, days stretching into weeks with no further communication, and she found herself unable to settle to any occupation for more than minutes at a time, starting at every sound of hoofbeats on the drive and checking obsessively for correspondence that did not arrive. Spring came to Ashford Manor with almost offensive beauty, the gardens erupting into bloom as if mocking her internal desolation, daffodils and tulips painting the grounds in cheerful colors while she walked among them, feeling like a ghost, haunting scenes of former happiness, and she thought bitterly that the world had no right to such renewal when her own life remained frozen in winter's grip. She alternated between moments of fierce belief Edmund would find a way. He had promised her he would find a way, and she must trust in his honor and determination, and periods of black resignation when she convinced herself that duty would ultimately claim him, that he would decide he could not in good conscience break his engagement regardless of his feelings, that she would spend the rest of her life knowing he loved her while he spent his bound to another woman, and both of them would survive but never truly live, going through the motions of their separate existences while their hearts remained forever locked in that storm-darkened library in a moment that could never be reclaimed. 2 years passed with a strange compression of time, seasons folding into one another, until Catherine could scarcely believe how long had elapsed since that March storm when Edmund had kissed her in the library and then vanished from her life, and she had remained largely at Ashford Manor through those years, venturing only occasionally to visit relatives or attend small local gatherings, for though her scandal had faded from immediate memory, she had no desire to thrust herself back into the society that had witnessed her humiliation, and in truth she had no heart for gaiety or courtship, carrying still the ache of Edmund's absence, even as she told herself she had made peace with their impossible situation. The reports that filtered to her through correspondence and occasional visitors painted a confusing picture. Edmund had indeed travelled to Bath 2 years prior. His engagement to Lady Rosalind had been dissolved by mutual agreement. The families had managed the scandal with remarkable discretion by attributing the separation to incompatibility discovered during Lady Rosalind's illness, and Edmund had retreated to his estates and been rarely seen in London society since, conducting himself with such icy propriety that even the gossips eventually lost interest in speculating about his private feelings, and Catherine understood from these fragments that he had freed himself from his obligation, but had not, as she had desperately hoped, during those first agonizing months come to claim her, and gradually she constructed a narrative that brought a kind of painful closure. Edmund had released himself from an engagement made in haste, but had lost courage about pursuing another attachment, or perhaps had decided upon reflection that his feelings for her had been merely the product of proximity and storm-heightened emotion, or perhaps, and this thought cut deepest, he had concluded, that she deserved better than a man who had been fool enough to nearly marry the wrong woman and who carried the taint of broken engagement, regardless of the circumstances. She had achieved by the spring of her 27th year a kind of peaceful melancholy, her days ordered and useful if not joyful, her heart no longer raw though permanently scarred, and she had made the decision to finally return to London for the season, encouraged by her mother, who gently suggested that life could not be lived in suspension forever, that Catherine was still young and might yet find happiness if she would only allow herself to seek it, though Catherine harbored no illusions that she would ever love another as she had loved Edmund, for that capacity seemed to have been spent entirely on a man who had kissed her once with desperate passion and then disappeared into silence, leaving her with nothing but memories that grew hazier with each passing month, until she sometimes wondered if she had imagined the entire storm-darkened confession, if perhaps she had constructed a fantasy from ambiguous words and a single kiss that had meant far more to her than to him, and so she prepared to return to London with resignation rather than anticipation, resolved to move forward with her life, even if forward meant only going through motions without genuine hope. Believing that Edmund had forgotten their confessions or decided they were better left unacknowledged, never imagining that her carefully constructed acceptance was about to be shattered, as completely as her heart had been shattered 2 years before. Catherine's arrival in London came on a late April afternoon, when the city was caught between spring rain and uncertain sunshine, the streets gleaming wet, and the air carrying that peculiar mixture of coal smoke and blossoming trees that she had nearly forgotten during her country exile, and as their carriage rattled through increasingly familiar streets, she felt a strange doubling of sensation, as if she were both the woman who had departed in humiliation 2 years prior and someone entirely different, transformed by time and suffering into a creature of greater self-possession, if considerably less hope. And when they finally reached the townhouse her mother had leased for the season, she stood on the pavement, looking up at the elegant facade, with the peculiar thought that she was returning to the scene of her greatest mortification, voluntarily, deliberately placing herself once more in the arena where she had been so thoroughly defeated, though she told herself firmly that defeat was perhaps too strong a word for what had transpired, for she had learned in the intervening years that there was a kind of victory in survival, in continuing to draw breath and move through one's days, even when the heart had been irreparably damaged. Society's reaction to her reappearance manifested in precisely the ways she had anticipated. Curious glances that lasted a fraction too long, whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she approached, a certain speculative quality in the greetings she received during afternoon calls and chance encounters in shops, as if the assembled ladies and gentlemen were attempting to discern whether Lady Catherine Ashford had returned to London in search of a husband, or merely to demonstrate that she had recovered from whatever affliction had caused her spectacular collapse at the Duke of Hartwell's engagement ball, and she met these attentions with a composure she had cultivated carefully, holding herself with quiet dignity and refusing to betray by word or expression that she felt any discomfort at being once more the subject of gossip, for she had learned that dignity was a kind of armor, perhaps the only armor available to women of her position, and if her smiles did not quite reach her eyes, she trusted that most observers would attribute this to natural reserve rather than profound heartbreak. The ball at the Worthington estate came a week after her arrival, and she dressed for it with meticulous care, choosing a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the color of her eyes, and accepting her maid's assistance with her hair without the nervous flutter that had characterized her preparations in years past, for she no longer harbored any expectations that the evening would bring anything more than an opportunity to demonstrate her ability to navigate society's expectations with grace, and when she entered the glittering ballroom on her father's arm, she felt almost nothing, not the oppressive anxiety of her last London ball, not even the melancholy she had anticipated, merely a kind of numbness that she supposed was what passed for peace when one had accepted that certain doors had closed forever. She had been engaged in conversation with Lady Melbourne about some charitable initiative for perhaps a quarter hour, her attention only partially present as she made appropriate responses, while her mind wandered to whether she might reasonably excuse herself early without causing offense, when some subtle shift in the atmosphere made her glance toward the far side of the ballroom. And there, standing beside a marble column with a glass of wine in his hand, looking as if he had materialized from her most persistent dreams, was Edmund, and their eyes met across the crowded room with an impact that drove the breath from her lungs and sent her heart into a rhythm so violent she feared it might be visible through her gown, and she watched with a kind of paralyzed fascination as his expression transformed from careful neutrality to something raw and unguarded, as he set down his glass with hands that trembled visibly even at this distance, as he began moving toward her through the crowd, with obvious purpose and complete disregard for the conversations he interrupted or the startled glances that followed his progress, his gaze never leaving her face as if he feared she might vanish if he looked away for even a moment, and Catherine stood frozen in place, with Lady Melbourne's voice fading to meaningless sound in her ears as Edmund drew closer, cutting through the assembled guests like a ship through water, and she had just enough presence of mind to think with a kind of desperate confusion that she was not ready for this encounter, that she had constructed her fragile peace on the assumption that she would never again have to face the man who had kissed her with desperate passion and then disappeared into 2 years of silence. But ready or not, he was nearly upon her now, and there was nowhere to retreat, and no defense against the hope that rose in her chest like a phoenix from ashes she had thought long cold. Edmund reached her side, and the world contracted to just the space between them, Lady Melbourne's voice trailing away as the older woman tactfully withdrew, leaving Catherine standing alone, facing the man who had haunted 2 years of sleepless nights, and his first words came low and intense, pitched for her ears only, though she heard them as clearly as if he had shouted them across the ballroom. "I never married her." And Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt something crack in the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no sound emerged, her mind struggling to process the significance of those 4 words, while her body swayed slightly, as if she might faint again, might complete the symmetry by collapsing at his feet a second time, but Edmund's hand shot out to steady her elbow with a touch that burned through the silk of her glove, and he said urgently, "Forgive me, I should not have, Catherine. Might we speak privately? I have much to explain, and I cannot do so here with half of London watching us." And she managed a jerky nod, her voice returning in a whisper. "The terrace, through those doors," and he offered his arm with such desperate courtesy that she nearly laughed at the absurdity of propriety observed in this moment of complete emotional chaos. But she placed her hand on his sleeve and allowed him to guide her through the crowd toward the French doors that opened onto the Worthington terrace, feeling the weight of 100 curious gazes following their progress, and caring not at all because Edmund had said he never married her. And that single statement had shattered every assumption Catherine had constructed during 24 months of silence. The terrace was blessedly empty, the cool night air a relief after the overheated ballroom, and the music and conversation faded to a muted backdrop as Edmund led her to the far corner, where shadows from potted topiaries offered the illusion of privacy, and he released her arm and turned to face her, his hands flexing at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her but did not dare, and Catherine found her voice at last. "You never married her. I know. The report said your engagement was dissolved, but Edmund, that was 2 years ago, and I have heard nothing from you in all that time, and I do not understand why you are telling me this now, why you are here, What you and her words tumbled over each other in a rush of confusion and carefully suppressed hope until Edmund interrupted. I went to Bath 2 years ago, after I left Ashford Manor, after that storm, after I kissed you and confessed everything like a madman. I went directly to Bath, and I told Lady Rosalind the truth that I loved another, that I had made a terrible mistake in offering for her, that I could not in good conscience proceed with a marriage when my heart belonged elsewhere. And Catherine's breath caught because he had said it so plainly. Loved another, his heart belonged elsewhere. And Edmund continued, the words pouring from him as if a dam had broken. And Catherine, she was extraordinary about it. She said she had sensed my reluctance from the beginning, and she confessed that she had formed an attachment to a naval officer, a Captain Reynolds, whom her family considered beneath her station, and she had agreed to our engagement because her parents wished it and because she believed she could not have the man she truly wanted. And so we freed each other. We ended the engagement by mutual consent, and the families managed the scandal by attributing it to incompatibility discovered during her illness. And I thought, God help me, I thought I would come to you immediately, that I would ride straight back to Ashford Manor and tell you I was free and beg you to marry me. But Catherine, I was a disaster. I was a man who had broken an engagement regardless of the circumstances. I had obligations to settle, and a reputation to manage and a life to reorganize. And I told myself I needed to put my affairs in order before I had any right to claim your affections. I needed to be worthy of approaching you, and weeks turned to months, and I convinced myself you would have moved on, that you would have realized during my absence that I was not worth your regard, that a man who had been fool enough to nearly marry the wrong woman and who had caused such scandal was not a suitable husband for someone of your grace and goodness. And so I stayed away, and I have been the greatest coward who ever lived, and I have no right to stand before you now except that I saw you across that ballroom, and I knew I could not let another day pass without telling you that I never married her because I could not marry anyone who was not you. Catherine stood perfectly still as his confession washed over her. 24 months of silence explained in a torrent of words, and she felt anger and relief and joy and residual pain all warring in her chest, and she said with a calmness that surprised her, You stayed away for 2 years because you thought yourself unworthy? You left me with nothing but memories of a kiss and a confession and 2 years of silence because you were putting your affairs in order? And Edmund flinched at the quiet devastation in her voice. Catherine, I know I have hurt you unforgivably. I know I should have written, should have sent word, should have trusted that you— But she interrupted. Did you truly believe I would judge you for ending an engagement that would have made you both miserable? Did you think so little of my understanding? And he shook his head miserably. I thought everything of your understanding. I thought you too good for a man who had made such a mess of his life. And Catherine felt tears prick her eyes because even in his absence, even in his misguided nobility, he had been thinking of her, protecting her in his broken way. And she whispered, I thought you had forgotten me. I thought our confessions meant nothing to you, I thought. But now Edmund did reach for her, his hands grasping hers with desperate urgency. Forgotten you? Catherine, you have been the only thought in my head for 2 years, the only reason I have continued through each pointless day. I stayed away because I am a fool, but never because I forgot you or stopped loving you. And there it was again, that word, loving. And Catherine looked up into his face and saw such raw emotion there that her anger dissolved into something softer, something that felt dangerously like forgiveness, like hope, like the beginning of trust being rebuilt from ruins. Edmund's hand still held hers with desperate urgency as he said, voice rough with emotion, Catherine, I know I have forfeited any right to your trust. I know 2 years of silence cannot be easily forgiven, but I am asking if you can find it in your heart to grant me a chance. Would you permit me to court you properly? To prove through consistent action rather than sporadic confession that my feelings are steadfast and true. And Catherine felt the question reverberate through her entire being, felt the weight of what he was asking and what she risked by agreeing, for her heart had been broken once by his absence, and there was no guarantee that this time would end differently. Yet as she looked into his face and saw the vulnerability there, the genuine fear that she would refuse him, she found she could not deny him or herself this possibility, and so she whispered, Yes, Edmund, you may court me, though I confess I am frightened of hoping again. and the relief that flooded his expression was so profound that she felt her own eyes fill with tears, and he raised her hands to his lips and kissed them with a reverence that felt like a vow, and thus began what society would later call the most romantic courtship of the season, though in truth the romance was tempered for Catherine by a necessary caution, by the internal guards she maintained around her heart, even as she allowed Edmund back into her life. The weeks that followed took on a quality of careful reconstruction, of two people learning to trust what they had nearly lost, and Edmund proved himself dedicated to the task, with a consistency that slowly began to erode Catherine's protective walls. For he called upon her every day that propriety allowed, appeared at every social event she attended, arranged theatre visits and afternoon drives through Hyde Park with her mother or sister as chaperone, conducted himself with such obvious devotion that society's gossips found endless fascination in the development, whispering behind fans about the Duke of Hartwell, who had nearly married the incomparable Lady Rosalind Pemberton, but now pursued with single-minded determination the Lady Catherine Ashford, who had fainted at his engagement ball, and speculation ran rampant about what had transpired between them, whether there had been a secret understanding all along, whether Catherine's collapse had been the result of concealed passion rather than mere physical weakness, and Catherine found she did not care what stories society constructed, because the truth was complicated and precious, and belonged only to her and Edmund, and gradually, through accumulated small moments and gestures, she began to believe that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps his love was as enduring as he claimed. Their conversations during those weeks revealed how both had been transformed by their separation, for Edmund spoke of the isolation he had felt during his engagement to Rosalind, the sense of sleepwalking through a life that belonged to someone else, and how ending that engagement had required him to examine what duty truly meant, whether honor was served by maintaining commitments that would bring misery to all involved, or whether there was a higher honor in acknowledging difficult truths. And Catherine listened and understood that he had grown from the man who had proposed to Rosalind, out of family pressure, into someone capable of choosing his own path, regardless of others' expectations, while she herself had learned during her country exile that she possessed reserves of strength she had not known existed, that she could survive heartbreak and emerge with her essential self intact, and these revelations drew them together, not as the childhood friends they had been, but as adults who had earned their love through suffering and self-knowledge. And when Edmund reached for her hand during a walk through the park, and she allowed him to take it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers even through their gloves, it felt like a conscious choice rather than mere surrender to feeling, and that made it more precious than any thoughtless passion could have been. And slowly, carefully, Catherine allowed herself to hope that the story which had begun with her collapse and continued through years of pain might yet have the ending her heart had always wanted, but had learned not to expect. Edmund arrived at Ashford Manor on a midsummer evening, when the air hung warm and heavy with the scent of blooming roses, and Catherine's father had received him in the study an hour earlier to grant formal permission for what both men knew was coming. And now Catherine stood in her chamber, while her maid fastened the last pearl buttons on a gown of pale rose silk that made her skin glow in the golden light slanting through the windows, and her mother entered with eyes already bright with unshed tears of joy, touching Catherine's cheek with such tenderness that Catherine felt her own emotions rise dangerously close to the surface, and her mother whispered, "He is waiting for you in the garden, my darling girl, and I have never seen a man look as he does tonight, as if he is about to receive everything he has ever wanted." And Catherine descended the stairs, with her heart beating so hard she thought surely everyone in the house must hear it, and she stepped through the French doors onto the terrace, where the evening sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold, and there in the rose garden that had been her mother's pride for 30 years stood Edmund, dressed formally in dark evening clothes that made him look every inch the duke he was. But his face as he turned toward her held nothing of aristocratic reserve, only an emotion so raw and profound that Catherine felt tears prick her eyes before a word had been spoken. He came to her and offered his arm and led her deeper into the garden, where roses climbed trellises and spilled over stone walls in cascades of pink and white and deepest red, their fragrance intoxicating in the warm air, and he brought her to a small clearing where a table had been set with linens and crystal and silver, and candles waited to be lit, though the sun had not yet set. and he turned to face her and took both her hands in his, and Catherine thought, this is the moment. This is when everything changes. And Edmund began to speak, his voice steady but threaded with feeling. Catherine, I have rehearsed these words 1,000 times, and yet now that you stand before me, I find all my practiced eloquence inadequate. For how does a man express in mere words what you have come to mean to me? And he paused, his thumbs stroking across her knuckles in an absent gesture that made her breath catch, and he continued, We have known each other since childhood, and I was fool enough to believe that familiarity meant I understood you, that I knew the measure of what we could be to each other, and I nearly destroyed both our lives through my blindness and cowardice. And Catherine, I wasted years we might have spent together, because I chose duty over truth and propriety over love. And when I finally understood what I had done, when I saw you collapse at that ball and knew with devastating certainty that I had broken your heart, as surely as I had broken my own, it was almost too late. I had bound myself by honor to a woman I did not love, while the woman I loved beyond all reason believed herself nothing to me. And Catherine's tears spilled over now, running down her cheeks unchecked, and Edmund released one of her hands to brush the tears away with infinite gentleness, and he said, But we have been given a second chance, an undeserved mercy, and I will not waste it through hesitation or false nobility, and so I am asking you now, Catherine Ashford, if you will do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to spend the rest of my life proving that my love is worthy of yours, of building with me the life we should have had from the beginning. And he sank to one knee there among the roses, still holding her hand, and Catherine found her voice at last, thick with tears, but clear in its certainty. Yes, Edmund, yes, I will marry you. And he surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, and kissed her with a joy and passion that held nothing of the desperate sorrow of that kiss in the storm years ago. This kiss tasting instead of promise and future and everything good they would build together. And when they finally drew apart, both were laughing and crying at once. And Edmund produced a ring his grandmother's, he told her, emeralds and diamonds that caught the sunset, light and glowed on her finger like a benediction. And they stood together in the garden while the sun sank lower and the candles were lit by unseen hands, and her parents emerged to offer tearful congratulations, and her father shook Edmund's hand with such warmth that Catherine knew he had long since forgiven the years of pain his daughter had endured. And as full darkness fell and stars began to emerge overhead, Catherine leaned against Edmund's shoulder and felt for the first time in years that everything was exactly as it should be, that all the suffering and waiting had led to this moment of perfect rightness, and she knew with absolute certainty that the life stretching before them would be everything they had dreamed, and more, built on foundations of hard-won understanding and love that had survived every test to emerge stronger and truer than either of them had dared to hope. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the air held that particular clarity that comes only in October, and the small chapel on the Ashford estate grounds stood dressed in garlands of late-blooming roses and trailing ivy, its ancient stones warmed by pale sunlight that streamed through stained glass windows and painted the interior in jeweled colors. And Catherine stood in her chamber, while her mother and Eleanor fastened the last pearl buttons on her gown of ivory silk, overlaid with delicate lace that had belonged to her grandmother, her veil held in place by a tiara that Edmund had sent, with a note saying it had been his mother's, and he could think of no one more worthy to wear it. And when Catherine looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the girl who had collapsed at that terrible ball, but a woman who had survived heartbreak and emerged with grace intact. And her father came to escort her to the chapel, with tears in his eyes that he tried manfully to hide. And as they walked the short path through gardens where she had played as a child, she felt the rightness of this moment settle into her bones, the sense that every painful step of the journey had led precisely here. And then she was at the chapel door, and the music swelled, and she entered to see Edmund standing at the altar in formal dark clothes that made him look devastatingly handsome. But it was his face that caught her breath, for he watched her approach with such transparent emotion that she felt tears threaten her own composure, and she had never seen him look at her like this before, as if she were something precious beyond measure, as if he could not quite believe his fortune in claiming her as his wife. And when she reached him and her father placed her hand in Edmund's, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, and knew he was as moved as she, And the vicar began the ceremony with words about love and commitment that had been spoken in this chapel for generations, but which felt newly minted for them, earned through years of misunderstanding and separation, and finally hard-won clarity. And when Edmund spoke his vows, his voice was steady but rough with feeling, as he promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life. And Catherine's own vows emerged clear and certain, each word a choice she made with full knowledge of what they had overcome to stand here together. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Edmund lifted her veil to kiss her, it felt like the sealing of something that had always been meant to be, and the small gathering of family and close friends erupted in applause, and Catherine saw Thomas Blackwood beaming with satisfaction, as if he had personally arranged their happiness, and later at the wedding breakfast he gave a toast that spoke of patience rewarded, and love that refused to be denied. And Eleanor wept openly with joy for her sister, and among the gifts and letters of felicitation was one from Rosalind, now Mrs. Captain James Worthing, expressing sincere happiness for their union, and noting that sometimes the breaking of one promise allows for the keeping of truer ones. And as afternoon faded into evening, Catherine and Edmund departed for Hartwell Estate, amid showers of rose petals and good wishes, and during the carriage ride, Edmund held her hand and kept raising it to his lips, as if he needed constant reassurance that she was real and truly his. And when they arrived at his estate as the sun was setting, and he carried her over the threshold of what was now their home, Catherine felt a happiness so profound it almost frightened her. And that first evening as husband and wife, they sat before the fire in their private chambers and talked quietly about the future they would build. And Edmund pulled her close and whispered against her hair, "Do you know, I find myself grateful you fainted at that ball, for it shattered my blindness before it was truly too late. And though I hate that you suffered, I cannot regret what it ultimately brought us to." And Catherine turned in his arms and kissed him and replied, "Then let us be grateful together, and for all the pain that led us home to each other." And in the firelight, with the autumn night deepening beyond the windows, they held each other close, and knew with perfect certainty that they had finally claimed the life they were always meant to share.